Hi, everybody here. I'm happy to introduce Karla Ausderau, who is in the Department of Kinesiology and a Weissman researcher who studies autism, and she has a really interesting partnership with the Madison Children's Museum that she's going to talk about, and including some of her research. So, there you go. I'm going to pass around a sign-in sheet, so please sign your name. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you. I was very excited to get the opportunity to talk about this because this is kind of an offshoot from my primary research program, but I don't view it as being all that different because I'm really interested in families who have children with autism and how they engage in occupation and participate in their community. And so while most of my work up to this point has focused on occupations that often occur in the home, we're also really interested in community engagement and things that occur outside of the home. And as many of you know, I've focused a lot on feeding and mealtime, and people do eat outside the house and in museums and community settings. And that's just one of the things that they need to negotiate when they do outside community activities. And so today I get to talk a little bit about accessibility and inclusion for families with children with autism in cultural institutions and community spaces. And that really builds on our partnership with the Madison Children's Museum. So today, I know everybody here knows what autism is, but I want to talk briefly how it's being situated in cultural institutions. What does the literature say about community participation and specifically on accessing museum communities? A little bit about the Madison Children's Museum Coalition, and some of you in this room have maybe attended some of those meetings. A national field survey we did to get a little bit of understanding of what our institutions around the country and some in Canada as well doing right now to support family engagement in cultural institutions. And then our big part of the project, which is still ongoing, is we developed a toolkit to try and assess cultural spaces, and we're piloting and getting some feedback for further revisions. And so that's what we'll do. So first of all, of course, nothing happens without a team. And sometimes at the end, we all get a little rushed. So I wanted to make sure right away to talk about the amazing team we have working on this project. And we have many students in our lab, and this is an area of great interest for them. And so the amount of people who have contributed to the work that I'm going to talk about today is quite phenomenal. And just to name a few of our primary players, Scott Allen, Nikki Frelick, Holly, Libby, Robin, Yasmina, and Nicole Nelson really have been all instrumental in creating some of the things you'll see today. And our primary partner in the community has been the Madison Children's Museum. And Sandra, who I know some of in the room also know, has been really the representative who continually meets with us and gives us feedback and negotiates and sets up meetings with the appropriate people at MCM to help us think about and revise whatever we're working on at that time. So I want to make sure that Sandra gets her say here as well. And so we all know about autism spectrum disorder and its prevalence, which means that people in the community and families with children with autism are accessing our community spaces and our cultural institutions. And I am 100% sure that everybody in this room has heard about sensory-friendly events, right? Autism-friendly events. And that seems to be right now what people are thinking about with community access, is how can we modify or adapt the sensory environment to promote participation. However, autism is much more than sensory processing challenges. And so we really have had quite a few discussions around that, is that when we think about how we're going to promote engagement in community spaces, that we need to think broader than just sensory processing or sensory challenges, that there's a lot of other core characteristics of autism that can make it difficult to negotiate these spaces. And so when we think about trying to make an environment engaging, we have to go beyond sensory processing and thinking about what else do we need to do to promote family participation. And where that also takes us to is our own institutional cultural knowledge. And so what we as individuals who work with families with autism, with children with autism, through research or in community practice, have a way that we think might best support their engagement. So sometimes structure, predictability, things like that are some of the words that might come to our minds. But when you think about a museum and a children's museum, what are some of the things you think about? Not structure and predictability, right? They want to design their environments in a way that allow for maximum possibility and maximum creativity, which in some ways can mean maximum unpredictability, right? And so when we think about how I would approach, okay, I see this environment and these are the things that I think might best work to support engagement, they might say, no, 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 no. Because now what you're doing is you are theoretically going against some basic principles of how we want to use our space. And so the negotiation around that is a really wonderful interprofessional collaboration and such a great opportunity for students to be a part of, to say, okay, let me hear what are some of the founding principles of your institution, and let's look at your goals, and then let's think about how can we intertwine the two while still meeting the needs of this unique population without compromising what your institution stands for. And so that's just been this amazing opportunity to negotiate. So anytime we start thinking about a challenge, we want to dig into the literature first. And so we know overall that symptom severity and core characteristics affects home and community participation. And we know that it affects the type of activities that families and children participate in, as well as the frequency. And that is not new information. We know that often if you have a child with autism, you base your activity choices around the needs of that particular child in your family, even if you have more than one child. It shapes what they choose to do. It shapes how they prepare to engage in that activity. And it also, some of the more qualitative work has really uncovered that it shapes the meaning and shared experience that a family has around that activity versus if you don't have a child with autism. And really they found that overall, families with kids with autism are less likely to participate in spontaneous or planned community outings or recreational activities, which I think is important for us to note. Parents have to do lots and lots of scaffolding in the community to support children's participation, particularly accommodating for sensory and behavioral challenges to try and get through the experience. And that's something that I'm hoping we'll think a little bit about, is tolerating a community environment versus actually engaging. And sometimes I think some of the sensory-friendly events or sensory modifications allow children to physically be in the environment, but does it really support a shared experience of the family in that community environment? And so overall, we're concerned that if these community outings are creating high levels of stress, we're going to have difficulty having family cohesion around community events, reduced participation. And if we have families with children with autism or sensory processing challenges or other intellectual developmental disabilities avoiding these spaces, they're at an even greater risk for marginalization. And we found that come through both quantitative and qualitative studies. So then focusing a little bit more specifically on museums, and particularly children museums, because these are supposed to be environments that invite children, all community members. It's supposed to be this place of shared experience. How are families negotiating or participating in those environments? And we're really finding that children with ASD are significantly underrepresented in the demographics, and they're not attending the museums as much as kids without ASD. They have a lot of difficulty finding the necessary supports, even with all the sensory-friendly events that are occurring. They find that there's limited opportunity to provide feedback to community environments and community spaces, saying these kinds of things might help me. These are the things that might make it more successful for my family to participate, and that there's a real mismatch between the family and child's needs and what the environment provides. Another group did a specific comparison looking at museum participation with kids with autism and without autism. And again, it really fits with a larger or broader literature on community participation, which you may say, well, of course, right? But maybe not, because you might hope that someplace that's specifically targeting a diverse group of children, they might not have as much decreased participation as we do in other community activities, such as attending church or a park, right? That these museum spaces are supposed to be an opportunity for kids to participate. So we do still find decreased participation. They're suggesting the barriers are that the social interactions are difficult. And in this study, actually that was first. It wasn't the sensory environment. It was the difficulty with social interactions, significant safety concerns. And that's something that has also come up when we've been thinking about how do you ask questions and how do you make recommendations? Because museum spaces kind of are intertwined and they go on forever. And how does a child know they're supposed to stop? How does a parent know where their child is? How many entrances in and out of one thing are there? But if you make a recommendation saying, let's put a big red sign that says stop as an indication, nobody should go through this door, you get pushback because that's not the kind of signage that museums want to put up or cultural institutions want to put up. And there's a real resistance to putting up any extra signage that isn't part of the exhibit or part of the design. Okay, so again, one of those cultural clashes. So the safety concerns, and again, this lack of consistency or predictability in these environments. And parents are reporting 3 times more negative stress compared to positive, or negative emotions compared to positive attending these kinds of community spaces. So we get why they're not going. However, they did another study that did find when you tailor the museum experience and think about more of a universal design perspective, you can establish a more equitable environment. And parents do report they can have positive effects. And they did some outcome measures on children's cognitive performance and social behaviors in museum environments. So it is possible, right? We just need to be thoughtful about how we create those environments to have those positive interactions. So that was the first step, digging into the literature. And then next, so the first step is really thinking about, so what is the literature saying about what's going on? And there was a fair amount of descriptive information that I was telling you about and describing what some of the challenges are. And so next, I had 2 students, Holly, one who's in the audience, so she can answer specific questions. Think about, well, okay, so we know this is what's going on in the community, particularly as related to museums. So how about community level interventions? What are people doing and how is it being measured? Okay, because when you hear on the radio, Chuck E. Cheese this Saturday, sensory friendly event from 2 to 4, that's great. But A, is it really effective for families? Who's attending? What kind of shared experience do they have? So what kind of research is being done on actually what's happening in the community? What kind of community level interventions are happening, and are they measuring the effectiveness of those interventions? And so we did the first swipe trying to mostly look at like museum kind of spaces with very limited to no research and no articles. And so then they took a much broader approach and looked at what are the public spaces, or are public space interventions effective for families with children with intellectual or developmental disabilities on their participation, okay? So a much broader range than just museums and children with ASD to try and start capturing some results. And the first thing to think about, I don't know how many of you have participated or in conducting or reading a systematic review, but it's a pretty lengthy and strategic process. And they came out with 7 articles after widening their search, so there isn't a lot of community level intervention being done in this population. And when we looked at the intervention settings, so what community spaces are actually trying to implement interventions, it was faith-based communities, museum settings, and community centers. And those were really the primary 3 that were represented. We were a little surprised with the faith-based community settings coming up, but after we read a little bit more, it made sense, particularly in how the articles talked about such a strong commitment to participation and really thinking about what they could do to make all their families participate. And so that was the small green circle. And then the second green circle was thinking a little bit more about what the studies were actually telling us. And the family participation, so the first idea was this family participation in public spaces. And they found with a social participation model, so interventions that somehow tried to support the overall family engaging, not just the child, so more of a family level support system, did result in more frequent and reciprocal positive interactions for both the child and the families. Families reported more positive families experience, and again, this isn't just focused on the child. And what they found, some of these interventions occurred outside of the typical activity hours. So if it was a museum, maybe after our museum times, or after the prime times it was open from 9 to 5, they'd found that participating in these family programs, they were able to generalize and attend regular hour activities. And I think that that's a good point to pick up, because I think, again, a lot of these things that we're hearing in pop culture is these extra separate times. Come during the separate time, and you'll have decreased sensory environments. Versus some families are saying that, hey, I don't want to be separate, I want to be equal and involved at the same time. Now, other families are saying, hey, there's not a one-size-fits-all, and I can't, no matter what, participate. So maybe we need multiple models. But a couple of the studies did report that parents said after we had the opportunity to participate in separate, then we were able to integrate into the regular time. And I think that's a pretty cool accomplishment. So although the studies were small, I think that's really important. And then there was some talk about how the family or social focused interventions helped with financial concerns. And so financial barriers come up frequently in the literature about families with children with intellectual disabilities being able to access. And last but not least, physical participation, so figuring out how to physically modify the environment. And so those were three of the primary ideas around the family participation. And then we did have community support systems, which were primarily in the faith-based communities. And then last but not least, we had increased community engagement in cultural or community spaces, but that were actually reported from other activities. So Project Team is probably, it's not in Wisconsin, but Young Athletes through Special Olympics would be an example of that, is that there's a Young Athletes curriculum where individuals with intellectual disability are on teams and sports activities with kids without intellectual disabilities, and those activities seem to bridge community participation in a similar way, and was thought of as an intervention to promote family participation as well. So that takes us to jumping in to the Madison Children's Museum Coalition. So we were initially invited to be a part of some of the initial meetings, and I know there's a few other people, I think a couple other people at least in the room, who have potentially been to that meeting. And they received a 3-year private donation grant to think about how are they going to make their spaces more accessible to families with children with autism and sensory processing challenges. And through discussion, again, we started trying to pull apart a little bit. So can we think a little broader than sensory? And can we think a little bit more about some of the other challenges we think may be barriers for participation? And we even wanted to change it so we could make it children with autism spectrum disorders or sensory processing. And so we settled on and or, so that we could think a little bit, because we know that, sensory processing is a highly core associated characteristic, but we don't want to be so limited in that area. And so they really started thinking through a community needs assessment and bringing in coalition members, and they were tried to be pretty targeted with who they invited, and I think they had over 30 different agencies that were represented at some of the first meetings, to try and give feedback, to think about what's working well about our institution, what's not working well. If you could have anything that our institution could do, what would it be? Things like that. And they had a few really large group meetings. And what we realized sitting in some of the meetings is that there was a lot of really great ideas that were coming out from a lot of different perspectives, but nobody was really thinking yet about what was the museum community at Madison doing well, and where were there gaps as related to some of these things that were being suggested. So, actually, one of the primary thing that came out repetitively, has anybody, you can't answer because you were there, but could anybody guess, has anybody been to the Madison Children's Museum? Okay, so what do you think is the primary thing that came out of the advisory committee meetings when people were brainstorming about things to change and different things we want to do? Does anybody have any ideas, any guesses? Yep. It wasn't safety, nope. We need to change this. Adaptations to make it more friendly for families with children with ASD and sensory processing. Yeah? Make it less loud. You're on the right track, but it was very targeted. Nope. Yeah, but what sound? Those of you who frequent the museum will know as soon as I say it. Hand dryers in the bathroom. They have the worst hand dryers in their bathrooms, possibly in the whole state of Wisconsin, possibly in the entire United States. They're terrible. They are so terrible. And they're so terrible that you have these 30 agencies that are really a diverse group of stakeholders, and that's something that comes up. You got to get rid of the hand dryers. The hand dryers have to go. And not only are the hand dryers like super offensive, they kind of are motion hand detected, but they seem to go when you just walk by them. So it's a really big problem, and so it's really something simple. So those are simple things to address, right? We know that's a problem. But then they started talking about signage and this and that, and it really became clear that we didn't really know where the community was currently at for their strengths or their weaknesses, and really what needed to be modified and what would work best based on what the community needed and was saying, as well as what they currently had in place. Because they do have a lot of really good strengths, and they have worked pretty hard to try and create an open space for the community as a whole to be a part of the museum experience. So it became a great discussion around, well, what's the next step then? If we want to really think about making this place more accessible after we get rid of the hand dryers, what else can we do, and what should we do, and how can we go about figuring out what actually needs to be done? And so that was kind of one of our next steps to think about. And we really were hoping to think more about a universal design approach. So everything is labeled with autism spectrum disorders and or sensory processing challenges, but we really tried to think universal design because it's going to benefit all if we can make some of these modifications. And but due to their funding source, we really had to be specific in how we labeled it. So, how many of you have been to the museum? Does everybody know where this is? Okay. So if you look at this from the museum's perspective, what might be some of the strengths? From the museum's perspective, what are some of the strengths? Colorful, open, what else? Very creative. Inviting. Mm-hmm. Child-created opportunity, child-created products. Mm-hmm. Oh, lots and lots and lots of textures. You can't actually get away from them. The post in the middle, for those of you who haven't been there, have bottle caps and things on them. So if you run your hands up and down them, it's like kind of a rough texture, which if you enjoy that, it's really fun. But if you rub up against it, it can be a little bit abrasive. What else might be great from a museum's perspective in intentional design? High ceilings. Well lit.
No clear direction about what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to go in and explore and figure out what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. And I think that would probably be one of the things that they like most about it. There's endless possibilities. Absolutely endless possibilities. And we're taking it back. So behind us is the screen with all the paint, or the window, not the screen, the windows where you're allowed to paint on. And to our right, or your right, is some foot sinks where you press the sinks and the water comes out back and forth. So tons and tons of possibilities. Now, for those of you in the room who work with families or children with autism, or both, what would you say might be some of the challenges of this space? What? Overstimulating. So much going on, right? What else? Yeah, what are you supposed to do? Right? Yeah, in the back? Right, exactly. So, you know, and the thing is as well, just for all kids, there's no one size fits all. And I think the center pillar is such a great example because it's colorful, it's super fun, it has tons of detail, but it has tons of detail, it's super colorful, and it can be really rough. And so, that's a thing we talked about. It can be a real point of interest for kids, and they can really get passionate about feeling it and touching it and looking at it. And then, is that good or bad? Right? And how do you allow children to explore this environment without labeling their experience? And that became another really important thing to discuss. So if a child is very interested in that pillar and spends a lot of time feeling it and going up and down and exploring it, from the museum's perspective, that's great. They are playing with that pillar. And maybe from the parents' perspective, as some parents told us, so now we're here and they're stimming on the pillar and I can't get them to do anything else in the room. So I think it kind of depends on the perspective. And so when we think about assessing a community space like this, you can imagine how difficult it is to think about what are the strengths and weaknesses of this space and what may or may not be changed, and what might be some of the negotiation that occurs. So for example, someone who said there's no clear direction. What are we going to do? What's something you might recommend then to support a family who enters this space as far as direction and what they should do? What might be a strategy? Yeah, in the back.
Maybe a visual schedule ahead of time.
A visual schedule ahead of time, or even one posted in there, right? Like, when you get in this space, this is what you can do. Yep. Did you have something different, or? Which seems like a really clear match. When you get in the space, this is what you can do. There's huge resistance to that. Huge resistance. You don't define what can happen in these spaces, right? It's a space for creativity. So you can see some of the cultural tensions just between different education perspectives. And no one's right or wrong, right? It's just figuring out what works best in these spaces. So this is always a really great example of how we start thinking about and designing tools to assess space without labeling value on how it's supposed to be used depending upon the child's characteristics. So we always love this picture. So after some further discussion with Sandra, we decided that we would take a deeper dive into this. And our first step was to think about what are other cultural institutions doing around the country, right? Let's not recreate the wheel. Let's figure out what is everybody else doing, because we all are working to try and make our communities more inclusive. What are people doing to try and create a space that everyone can be a part of? Then let's think about assessing and using Madison Children's Museum kind of as an opportunity to do a self-assessment and develop tools in this iterative process, okay? And let's develop a toolkit that we think can not only be used here, but let's think of the greater good. Let's think universal design, and let's think cultural institution, not just children's museums. Because clearly, a children's museum, such as this hands-on engaging, is different than maybe an art museum that also wants to include children, or a science center, or a botanical garden, or a zoo. And these are all the kinds of places that are coming up that want to be participating in this activity. And then next, what works for Madison may not work for someplace in Texas, right? Or in Canada. And so you not only have different institutions, but you have different geographic areas as well. So we need to pilot that toolkit, gather some feedback, and think about how can we revise and make it more applicable for a wider range of institutions. So the first phase was a national field survey. And so we did a collaborative survey development with our team and with Sandra's larger team. And I would say almost everybody probably at MCM who is a paid position probably gave us some feedback on it, which was incredibly helpful. And I really feel like interprofessional collaboration and interprofessional teamwork is all the buzz right now, but this really was, I feel like, a true interprofessional collaboration as we moved forward. And we eventually settled on 16 questions, and the amount of time it took for those 16 questions is quite amazing. But we want them to be succinct so that we could have people in the community complete the survey for their institution in about 15 to 20 minutes, and target institutions, target people at institutions that would best have the knowledge. So we made a list of key institutions around the country that we really wanted to make sure that we were getting, and then we also decided to administer through a museum listserv. And so we're really happy. We had about 87 institutions around the country that completed the survey. They were primarily in the United States. We had a handful in Canada. We had no intention of collecting data in Canada, but it somehow got there. And actually, I think we have 1 or 2 in London. So word travels. But we thought that's fine because we'll think about those data if we pull them out, if we get enough of a subgroup. So overall, we had 87 institutions represented. And on occasion, we did have more than one individual fill out the survey for their institution, and we just tried to take whoever seemed to have a role that would be more identified with program development in this area. So who filled out our institution? Children's museums were the highest, or who filled out our survey? Children's museums were 38 of our sample, and science centers were another 25. And then some people do not want to be put into a box. That's another thing we were told, that if we have a mandated questions or we don't give people an other for cultural institutions, they will not fill it out. So we're like, we will give everybody other. And so a lot of people that put in other gave themselves like, I am both a children's museum and an art museum. I am both a children's museum and a science center, versus not wanting to be into one category. But we also did have a couple of aquariums, zoos, and botanical gardens that were part of our sample. So one of the first things we asked them, do you currently have any community partnerships that support program development for children and families with autism or sensory processing? And excitedly, 87% of them did. But we have to assume, right, that we are collecting data from people who want to be a part and want to know about this. So we do have a pretty skewed sample, I would say, as far as groups that do have partnerships. But I was still excited to see that cultural institutions are partnering up with local organizations to better meet their community's needs. And so many people, the highest number was with colleges or schools that are within proximity of these cultural institutions. So we're not unique. Institutions are reaching out to their local universities. Pediatricians, OTs, PTs, and behavioral specialists. A number of institutions were partnering with other local organizations such as Autism Speak, Easter Seals United Way, and other local autism community groups that were a little bit more diverse in their descriptions. How many of you have current programs that are specifically targeting increased engagement for families with children with autism and or sensory processing? And 56 of the programs out of 87 said, yes, we currently have programs. 4 said they had programs, but they said they were developed to meet a more universal design, with a more universal design approach in mind. 14 institutions said, no, we do not have any. But they are in development, and that was part of their interest in really participating in the survey. And 13 said, nope, not yet, but we hope to someday. And 0 said no, and I'm assuming that's, again, a bias of the type of survey that we collected. So that's good to see. So if you have programmings that are already in place, what are the programs? What are they? And the strong majority, which we should not be surprised because we hear about it almost every day, is 52 out of the 87 programs, and they could answer more than once or indicate more than one answer. 52 have sensory-friendly hours that are separate from other operating hours. That is by far the most popular activity. 13 institutions said they also have sensory-friendly hours within their normal operating hours. So I'm not sure how those are conducted. And one thing that people did talk about in the survey answers was that they've had to limit attendance, right? Because if you have 200 people show up for sensory-friendly hours, it no longer becomes sensory-friendly. So thinking about those kinds of challenges as well. 48 institutions say they have on-site tools and equipment and a wide variety, and that are things like headphones, fidget spinners, gloves, all kinds of different tools that can help modify the sensory environment for an individual, sunglasses, or help modulate behavior, is what I would suggest. 39 institutions already have pre-visit online resources, which I was pretty excited about. So ways that families can engage with the museum prior to attending. So many of them have virtual walkthroughs or videos that you can watch how to engage or possibilities to engage in certain in spaces. 26 have school field trip resources for school groups targeted specifically at this group. And 18 out of the 87, which I know it's not a lot, but I still found that very hopeful, level, already have community advisory boards or stakeholder advisory boards, which I hope that that's a trend that everyone's moving towards, which is exciting. So staff training. So we're particularly interested in, we need to think about the environment, but part of the environment is the people that are in the environment. And so who is doing staff training and what kind of training are they actually doing? And we were quite surprised to find 83% of the people that answered our survey are already doing staff training, which means that that's even higher than the number of people who have programming. Okay, so I think that's a big deal, is that even if people don't have designated programming yet, they are thinking thoughtfully about how do you train your staff to engage effectively with a wider range of people that attend your community space. And so what types of training with field experts, videos, and social stories available for the staff to think about what to expect and what to see, parents offering staff insight, and information sharing meetings. And one of the pieces of information that came up when we were piloting and interviewing people at the Madison Children's Museum was that they felt like they had really good training, but they didn't have opportunity to actually engage with children with autism or engage with families with children with autism. And so even during sensory-friendly events, they were like, well, people have talked to us about this. We know what autism is, but now we're here in the environment and we're not sure how to engage or what to do. So I think that bench to bedside is in the community as well. And information sharing meetings. So the next step is that if you're training your staff, how effective is your training? Because you can train people, but is it actually helping? And so 36% are actually doing some staff assessment to see how effective their training is, which I was quite impressed with. And so they observe staff in the context. They have staff actually give feedback on how effective their training was, and it was helpful. They give feedback in supervising meetings. A couple of institutions have parents provide feedback on staff training and interaction during specified events. And peer review, and a few institutions actually have their staff take tests after their trainings. So for me, this is mostly good news, right? So there's a wide awareness. Although there's tons of sensory-friendly events and things going on, there are some other thoughtful things taking place as well, thinking bigger than just sensory. But the concern, in my opinion, is still that they're not thinking about necessarily. There was very little report on thoughtfulness on, well, we do this because we've heard about it kind of thing, or, we've seen people are doing sensory events, but there isn't a lot of thought on, does it meet our institution needs, or tailoring programming to meet institution needs or community stakeholders. So that brought us to the next step. So let's think about developing a toolkit then to be a little bit more thoughtful about assessing your environments and thinking about this complex environment and hopefully in a wider scale, so we think more cultural institution-wise, to assess it, to figure out how can we tailor interventions, community-level interventions or institution-level interventions to make it more accessible for people and families with autism. So first, we wanted to come up with a theoretical lens, and being that we are occupational therapists, we had to dig into our OT literature to think about how could we frame and what could guide us to assessing this really complex environment, because hopefully I've gotten in, it's more than just a sensory stimulation. It's the physical space, it's the staff, it's the other people in the environment. There's tons of pragmatics around cost, parking, safety. What if there isn't good parking and it's downtown? How do you get from the parking ramp or wherever it is, and maybe that parking ramp is full? Like logistics. I mean, there's so many things that go into successful participation. So we went back and we adapted a model called the Person Environment Occupational Performance Model to think about how that could apply to a museum context. And just real generally is occupation in the top circle is thinking about what do you want to do, and what does that family or child actually want to do, and then the performance is actually physically doing it. Okay, and then when they meet in the middle, you hopefully have a transaction between what the person wants to do and then actually being able to do it. And it's not just physically being in the environment, but it's actually engaging and like trying to aim for that shared experience. So not just being present, but being a part of that experience. And so then you think about on the left, we think about what are the intrinsic factors, person factors that might shape what that person wants to do and how they may enact doing it, and clearly then how that transaction occurs, as well as there's multiple extrinsic or environmental factors that also are going to shape that. And so that's the model we decided to adapt. So the next step is we have to give a shout out to Scott Allen, who some of you know who works here at the Weissman Center, as he was instrumental because we, with our OT speak, I'm like, oh, this makes total sense. And he's like, nope, this doesn't make sense. And so he really was helpful at thinking about how we could adapt the model to use to think about creating assessment tools to adequately think about all the complex factors that are moving in this museum environment. So we spent a lot of time thinking about factors of intrinsic concerns or factors that were specific to families. And you can see discretionary income, pride or shame in public spaces, availability in time and schedule, family or cultural background that may support or how they want to engage in that museum context, desire to entertain or educate the child, right? They're two very different kind of goals. There's a lot of talk about development versus chronological age, and for those of you who have been to the Madison Children's Museum, is that one of the favorite spaces for a wide range of people is the nest. I'm blinking at it. You know what's the? It's the what? The wilderness. Yep. We were just there on Thursday night for a different event, so all the students have it fresh in their minds. The wilderness, and it's really designed as a space for children under a certain height, and I think it says under 5, or it used to be under 5, but it's also a beautiful sensory space with lots of places to kind of hide. It has a wonderful water fountain that you can play with, so it really is enticing to a much wider range of kids. And so how does chronological and mental age kind of mesh or sensory needs? And so that was a really big discussion that we've had about how spaces are used. Because we understand that there's spaces that are particularly for crawling infants. So if you have a crawling infant engaging in some of these nice closed, soft spaces, what does that mean when you maybe have a 12-year-old who is seeking out sensory input and deep pressure in that nice, soft space, colliding with a 6-month-old crawling infant? It doesn't always work well, and it's nobody's fault. So how do we create spaces that are helpful for everyone in that environment? And another kind of example of that is they're like, oh, well, let's have cool down rooms, right? Quiet sensory rooms for families. But they always have the quiet sensory rooms during sensory friendly hours. Do you need a quiet cool down room during sensory friendly hours? Probably not. But during regular hours, or not as often, but during regular hours, there isn't space for a quieter, calmer, cool down room. So you can see how kind of these conflicts start emerging. So you can kind of get the picture of how we thought about these intrinsic factors, and then we also started thinking about the extrinsic factors that were more influenced by the institution that families really don't have a lot of say over, but are going to really influence how that transaction takes place. And then we really didn't want to forget about the overall cultural context of individuals, but as well as the cultural spaces, because they really have ideas and values on how their space is supposed to be used. And then there's other institutional visitors, and that was something that came up. So other people that are using that space, and how do we engage in thinking about assessments and adaptations while also considering the overall population. And then there's a number of factors that are simply out of the institutional control. And so how do we think about all these different pieces to assess this space? So we started the Toolkit Development, and MCM was great because they wanted us to develop it on and with them. And so it was a real iterative process. So our larger stakeholder team started in with tons and tons of observations. And we observed camps, we observed drop-in programs, we observed scheduled programs, open hours, sensory-friendly hours, anything you can think of, we observed. And we started out with pieces of paper and pencil, and then we started creating structured observation forms, and they evolved with each observation. So based on what we were seeing, we tried to put, okay, well, it seems like you took notes here and here, and the forms would evolve over the process. And then we'd have a form, and then we'd take it back to Sandra and her team, and some things they'd love, and some things they wouldn't. And it all goes back to that cultural clash around how we were interpreting the behaviors and observations we were seeing. We also took a lot of time reviewing museum artifacts and materials, so websites, staff training, and all their current resources that they'd already implemented, and having, challenging them and thinking a little bit, okay, well, I see you have this at the front desk. Why do you have it here, and how would a family access it if they wanted to access it? Because that's the other thing, is that a lot of families don't know what resources community places have because it's not advertised in a way that really makes sense. And then we did interviews, and we interviewed parents, and we interviewed people who were part of the museum staff, and I say that very loosely. So volunteers, and then we tried to interview people at every level of their institutional hierarchy to get feedback around a number of questions. And so through all that, it was an iterative process, and we started developing the tools, and we'd develop them, and then we'd go to another event and use those tools and see what worked, and it was a very significant iterative process. So what we came up with, and it goes till 2:30, right? Okay. What we came up with was a comprehensive evaluation toolkit for cultural institutions, with a focus really on accessibility and inclusion for families and children with ASD and sensory differences, and then really also thinking that it's a universal design approach. So in a lot of the verbiage, that's what we try and incorporate as well. And we came up with 5 independent tools for a self-assessment. So we wanted this to be a tool that an institution could take and self-administer. And there's one piece where we are doing some open-ended, semi-structured interviews, and we recommend that, if possible, to have someone outside of the institution do those interviews, just for a more candid report to capture versus somebody within the institution. And so what we came up with was these 5 tools. The first was we called the Public Institution Questionnaire. And that's really the pragmatics of the museum visit. And it's to highlight for museums or other cultural institutions kind of maybe unnoticed patterns or barriers that may occur within their existing environment they may not even really be aware of. And so an example that might be parking. Parking came up a lot, which is so simple but so complex. So how much does parking cost? How long is it for? How far is the parking from the actual institution? Is there a walkway or is there a crosswalk to get from the parking place to the institution? And so just these real basic pragmatic things that families are worried about negotiating. So just a real pragmatic questionnaire about institution basics. Then we have a staff survey and a semi-structured staff interview, and this was really to gain insight from the staff perspectives. And we really want to value the diversity of all staff members, so we tried to layer questions so that whether you're a volunteer in the institution or the director of a board, the questions can be relevant, or there's different probes that would be relevant. Fully recognizing that all institutions don't have the time or the staff to do full semi-structured interviews, because they were really helpful for us, but might not be possible for many. We also tried to do a survey as well that they could complete and get some real basic information in kind of a Likert scale format around do they do training, what kind of training, did they find it helpful, things like that. We did a user-friendly website review form. Now, this was not a general accessibility website. This was more tailored as a view from what we were looking for. So do you have the programmings that you say you have? Are they posted on your website? How many clicks do I have to get to them? If you are doing pre-online resources, how available are they? Do they work on multiple formats of the computer? So really targeted at the questions that we had. We did observation of child engagement forums. This was by far the hardest to create because there was a lot of institutional clashing on this one in a good way, really in a good way. And so we were thinking about the physical and social environment that support or hinder participation and current strengths and needs. So going all the way from the lighting, the sound, to children actually engaging in the environment. So looking at both perspectives. And then last but not least, there's an event feedback form. So this is specifically for families to fill out after they've attended the museum and or after a special event. So it could just be a straight up attendance or if they've had a sensory friendly event. So I'm going to just quick go through these so we have a few minutes for question. So again, the public institution, this is just kind of a quick picture of like one of the pages look like. And again, it's parking, cost, flow, and what we mean by flow. A lot of museums or cultural institutions talk about they have somebody at the front who says, welcome to the museum. The hours are, do you need to pay? And so asking a little bit about how that person talks about resources that are available at the institution. So kind of the flow of entering and how you are able to access things. And it asks basic questions about staff. So how many staff do you have on the floor? Where are those staff located? If there's an emergency, how do you manage that with staffing? And more about basic programming. Again, the staff survey and semi-structured interviews are really about the individual roles and responsibilities. How comfortable and what training do people get to interact with families in general and children? Or if there's a tantrum, what kind of resources are they given or support? And then focusing down more specifically on children with autism and or sensory processing differences. Then about training effectiveness and what do you need? What would be the best kind of training you could get? And about the programs, adaptations, and what are typical days. And like I said, this was a 2-part survey. The user-friendly website review form. So we thought about this from different types of devices because clearly it's different on an iPad, phone, or Mac computer. And then thinking about inclusivity of the language as well as how they access information that might be relevant to their needs. Like I said, there was 4 parts to the child engagement form. The first part is really thinking more about the environment. So how sensory stimulating or how is the physical environment set up? The second is to actually complete while you're observing a child in that space. And that's for more of an open observation time. The third is for a program observation. So if they're running a class, a camp, something that's intended to have more structure to it. And last, there's one to complete immediately after the observation, kind of thoughts and perspectives on what's going on in that environment. And so here is the first part of one of the first forms. So in the physical environment, the volume, noise. And this form probably has 5 or 6 pages prior to it because it helps us think of, we had to do lots of definition defining. So when we say never almost, what does that mean? And then we went through and got some feedback on terminology that we felt needed to be defined. And then the event feedback form is very simple. We get feedback from families on their participation and engagement in the event. So the third step was piloting the toolkit, and so we started with 5 targeted institutions that Sandra thought would give us some good feedback. We just had 14 questions. It was a combination of short answers and multiple choices to really help us think about the effectiveness and applicability and strengths of our tool and areas that were needed for improvement. The pilot summary so far from just those few institutions was that the toolkit has multiple components besides just the assessments, and they appreciated we talk through the model in the toolkit, and then we talk about the purpose, how to administer, some definitions, and then we give some resources in the back. And they liked having the multiple components, not just the assessments. Diverse, inclusive, accessible, concise, and comprehensive. I don't know if I'd use the word concise. And shareable and versatile. And then constructive feedback is that this is probably the most common or the strongest one we got, is that they felt unqualified to administer the toolkit in their environments. And so we're still unpacking that a little bit. It was time consuming, difficulties. So there's 5 tools, and we really talk about how you don't have to use them all. Pick and choose what works best for your environment or what you might need to focus on. And so which tool do you use, how and where? And some measures of change already currently in place. How will this add and how might this contribute to measuring those changes? So we did some revisions based on our initial feedback, and now it is out there to the world and being piloted much more widely. And so now we have about 200 institutions that have downloaded it, and they have to go through, we've set up a survey that they have to complete in order to be able to download and get permission to use it. And then they give us lots of information so that we can follow up with them on how it's being used. And part of this whole process was not to create something that we'd hold dear and tight. It was to create something that could be used in the community and would need revisions. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. And so we're in the process of getting feedback from those 200 people. Institutions, not people. So what's next? So we'll continue to work with MCM clearly and revising and updating the toolkit as needed. We're thinking about more about the results that we got from evaluating their institution and creating it and thinking about what other changes may or may not be needed. Sandra would like us to take the new toolkit and reapply it to their institution in completion, and we'll see about that. Based on some of the primary feedback, I think we're considering doing some webinars that might be an opportunity for people to learn more and get some support on how to administer in your environment. I also think we need to change some of the language in the toolkit, that maybe some language shifts might make it more accessible for a wider audience to use and implement. So we're getting the information out there. Oops, spelling error. We're expanding our community outreach with this. So we have some students on the team who have been working with some other community organizations around some of these adaptations, and it's led to some new partnerships. We're going to be working with a group, hopefully, in rural Wisconsin about thinking about emergency rooms and emergency departments and how accessing those can be really challenging for families. And so what could we do to support a better utilization of those services that aren't optional, right? And so that's a really exciting thing that has come from this. And then I think next where this goes is then once you do the assessment, how do you think about community level interventions, right? Like more systemic changes that really can support ongoing participation for children and families in a meaningful way and actually engage in the community versus just being present. So lots to do. We have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, Mary.
Thank you. So one of the things that I hear from families quite a bit is that they like environments where, like the zoo here, you can come and go. There's
Yes.
not a charge to get in. But realizing that museums can't just have free, they might have a free day or a free whatever, or these separate events. Families are telling me that they don't want to necessarily not pay, but they like some kind of a system where they have like a yearly pass that they know they paid for, but they can come and go,
Right.
and not feel like, oh my gosh, if we paid the parking and paid the fee, and then our child.
You may get 2 minutes, right?
Yeah,
And somebody
then
uses the hand dryer.
And they don't want to leave, and then all
Yeah.
of that sometimes is such a barrier, so I don't know if that came up in any of the discussions. The other one that I hear quite a bit is that, well, I agree, the sensory-friendly event kind of thing. A lot of my families who don't necessarily have autism feel like that says that's for people with autism, but they feel like their family could benefit, and they feel almost like they have to explain why we're going. And so I don't know if there's a way around some of that language, like sensory-friendly technically isn't, but I think in sometimes, even though that's in there, people feel like that's code for autism. So I don't know if there's a way to think about it from universal design and while everybody is so variable, this is for everyone, so that families feel like they're all in it, and if they feel like they want to go, they don't have to explain why their child doesn't have autism and they're piggybacking on an autism event. So that's just some of the feedback I've heard. I didn't know some of that.
So the cost, that's something has been brought up significantly, and they're brainstorming on what do you do, and I'm not sure, I mean, I'd have to ask to Sandra where they ended on it, because, you know, if you're only there for a short time, can you get a refund and to use it to come again next time, or a credit to come again? Is there a sliding scale annual pass? Because they do have annual passes, but they're almost cost prohibitive for many families. So that is something that has been brought up, and I know they're working on, and I think the idea of the sensory-friendly events, I think we can't use that name anymore. I think we need to come up with new names and figure, because it is, and I mean, even with this project, is sensory processing challenges and autism were being used, interchangeably almost. I mean, not interchangeably, but, you know, they were being very closely tied when you're thinking there's a large population of children with and without different diagnoses that really could benefit from decreased stimulating environments for participation. And so how do we work towards sending that message in a way, but also then, I don't know if we did some events with Culver's here in the community that were student-led, that were super fun, but after we did a few of them, they were not sensory friendly anymore. Because it got to be really popular. It was a really fun social experience, but if you were coming for a sensory friendly experience at Culver's in that back room, it was not sensory friendly. And so, you know, trying to negotiate that, you know, how do you manage that, and then thinking about how could we incorporate some of the strategies needed into regular hours, or just in kind of more of a universal design approach versus having always designated or separate. Or maybe lots of different ideas. I'm sorry. Yep, back there, and then I'll come over here.
I just want to comment that the Children's Museum does have a sliding scale membership for.
And, yeah, and do they also have, they have one for IEP and early intervention, but do they also have an, one based on income as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I know for foster care, they pay like significant discounts too.
Yeah, my experience, and I know many of you with Madison Children's Museum, is that they are working hard, to initiate a project like this and let us develop and assess them in the process. I think speaks a lot to their commitment to the community and their engagement and things like that. Yeah. Yep.
I was also thinking, just kind of piggybacking on what you're saying, I mean, beyond like the sensory environments being useful for a lot of kids,
Mhm.
I feel like there's a lot of environments that are just sensory overstimulating for like the majority of the population now, like if you think about movies now and restaurants,
Mhm.
it almost feels like there has to be more of like a big push to kind of like create an awareness.
Mhm.
This doesn't work for a lot of people, elderly people, older people with, different kinds of disabilities.
Right, or not even with disabilities, right?
Yeah.
Just people.
People in
Yeah,
general.
no, I agree.
I like your comment about working with emergency rooms, which I can imagine, talk about a clash of what they have to get done and their purpose and things, but dental offices, if somebody wants to take on that challenge. I'm starting to actually see really nice headway, though. I had a family come today and their child needed orthodontic work, failed the opportunity to get that done, and the dental office put in so many nice resources, and she's gotten through her third appointment and is on her way to having that be successful. Not a small feat.
No.
And I know the whole idea of our groups of families even getting an appointment at the dental office is one thing, but having that be something that could get looked at would just be, like, talk about, that should be a basic human right, not a privilege to go to the dentist. So start there.
Yes.
And then after that, work on this would be just.
So there is a group who is tackling that and has actually significant funding from the Dental Association, the American Dental Association, out of USC. And it's Sharon Cermak and Leah Duker. And they have multiple published articles and have really done some nice work modifying and thinking about dentist office specifically, because there's some unique challenges clearly in that environment. So I can send you some resources. And it isn't, how many years does it take? 17 from an intervention to be applied widely in the community. But they've done some really fantastic work, and it's been well funded, which I think is exciting to know the commitment to that. Yep.
I think along with that, but to go back to the bathroom experience and the automatic flushing toilets and the loud hand dryers and stuff, maybe we could, someone could say, hey, engineers, can you work on, we're all for environmental
Yeah.
friendly and everything, but can we tone down the sound a little more?
Well, Holly, do you know, have they addressed, because there's some things that, so working on an interprofessional team, Sandra's always working really, really hard. And I don't know all the museum details all the time, so sometimes I lose track of what they've done or what they haven't done or what they already have. Have they already changed the hand dryers? Did you notice on Thursday? Okay, and I didn't hear them on Thursday. We were there we work with a school-age parenting project for pregnant and parenting teens in Madison, and so we're there on Thursday nights, and so it's pretty quiet, kind of quiet, and I didn't hear any dryers, now that I said that. But
Just the children's museum, it's also like
Right.
the mall, a lot of public spaces for families.
Totally. Thank you. So I think we've gone over by a few minutes. So if anybody is interested in further discussing, we love to talk about it. So we can contact me afterwards or by email. I'd love to share what we're doing. Thanks.